Finding the best motherboards for each processor is not exactly the easiest thing in the world. First, we have to cater to one feature that stands out about each processor. In the case of the 10900K, that happens to be the high frequencies and excellent overclocking support. The i9-10900K is already an exceptional performer in games, and overclocking can make it even better. It is important that the motherboards in our roundup address that feature. That's why you'll mostly see Z490 and Z590 motherboards on this list. A lot of Z490 boards make more sense, as we'll see in the roundup. Z590 might be the latest and greatest, and it does bring PCIe Gen 4 to the table, but the 10900K does not support it. Even then, some Z590 motherboards are more future-proof, so you'll see a few on this list regardless. The 10900K is anything but a mainstream processor. It's aimed at professionals, creators, and professional gamers/streamers. That's why we tried to keep the list diverse, to appeal to all the types of people we just mentioned. The 10900K is also great if you want to experiment with over-the-top overclocking, maybe even with some liquid nitrogen thrown into the mix. That is why there are a few very high-end motherboards on here. Once we select the list of our favorite motherboards, the task was to simply score them based on different categories and then rank them accordingly based on an average score. With all that said, let's take a look at the roundup. Price information and all motherboards mentioned in the video are available in the description. Number 5. ASROCK Z490 TAICHI. There's one reason, and one reason alone, as to why the Z490 TAICHI is so impressive. It's because of the unique and outlandish design. Anyone who's a fan of the design will find any reason they can get to cover this motherboard. It's not all about the design, though, as this motherboard is an excellent value through and through. Since we're so fond of the design, let's cover that first. ASROCK continually changes up the look of their TAICHI motherboards from time to time. This is one of the most premium finishes yet. It features a fashionable black and copper color theme and is complemented by the clockwork-styled heatsinks. There are also a few clockwork stencils on the rear cover panel. Customizable RGB zones are also present, which further add to the aesthetic value. Besides the design, what else does this excellent Z490 motherboard have to offer? Well, you get 3 full-length PCIe 3.0x16 slots, 3 PCIe 3.0 M2 slots, and a robust 12+2 phase VRM design. This VRM configuration is more than enough for the 10900K and should appeal to overclockers. You also get fast memory support with 128 gigs of RAM that can run up to 4666 MHz. We also have support for NVIDIA SLI and AMD Crossfire. Apart from that, the port selection is quite good, and you even get Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth support here. As mentioned before, overclocking is quite good here, as the massive heatsinks and shrouds help with heat dissipation a lot. The number of features you're getting here for the price makes this an excellent price-performance choice. The only downside is that we are aware not everyone is going to be as enthusiastic about the design. This is because the look of this motherboard is admittedly a bit outlandish. A lot of people will love it, others not so much. Regardless, this is a solid all-rounder Z490 pick. Number 4. GIGABYTE Z490 AORUS XTREME. Both Z490 and Z590 chipsets have motherboard choices that are a bit more than over the top. The GIGABYTE Z490 AORUS XTREME is an excellent example. This motherboard has all that any enthusiast could wish for, and it outdoes itself in that regard exceptionally well. On paper, this is one of the best Z490 motherboards money can buy. Of course, all of that comes at a high cost. Let's talk about the design first, which is arguably the most exceptional aspect here. This motherboard has gigantic heatsinks for the chipset and M2 slots. These are combined into one uniform unit for better heat dissipation. You'll notice there are no headers at the front, as everything has been moved to the side. This includes the ATX power port, SATA ports, fan header, USB headers, front panel ports, and even the RGB headers. The CPU pump and fan headers are at the top, along with an OC button for overclocking. You can customize this button so that it saves a custom profile for overclocking. You also get onboard power and reset buttons, if you want to use this on a test bench. The look and feel of this motherboard are beyond premium. It even features a massive metal backplate for maximum heat dissipation. The design is not all this motherboard has going for it. Featuring a massive 16-phase VRM configuration, this motherboard is ripe for overclocking. Thanks to the excellent overclocking features, you can experiment like crazy with the 10900K, and even on the memory. This motherboard was made for hardware enthusiasts, even those who want to play around with liquid nitrogen overclocking. Needless to say, this is a very impressive motherboard. We have not even talked about the rear I/O and connectivity, as this has everything you could want. Thunderbolt 3, Type-C, S/PDIF, dual Ethernet ports, and more. Obviously, all of this comes at a price that's tough to justify, even for some hardware enthusiasts. Number 3. MSI MPG Z490 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. For people who have or are planning to buy a 10900K, we know that these premium motherboards can be a bit daunting. However, if you're on a budget, that does not mean you need to constrict yourself. For that situation, the MSI MPG Z490 Gaming Edge is one of the best choices. This motherboard sits below the Gaming Pro Carbon and MSI's stack of Z490 choices. The former has fewer options than the latter, but appeals to a wider audience thanks to the excellent value. Design-wise, we have a subtle yet consistent theme with this board. It features black heatsinks that are contrasted by the gray accents on the PCB. The chipset heatsink is also an RGB zone, as it has addressable RGB LEDs underneath. As for expansion, you have access to 2 full-length PCIe 3.0x16 slots, and additionally 2x1 slots, dual M2 slots, and the usual 6 SATA ports. Some people would have liked to see an additional M2 slot, but that is something MSI has done to cut down the cost. The top M2 slot does feature an aluminum heatsink, which is always good to see. The VRM design uses 12 +1 power stages, and 12 phases are dedicated to the CPU. High-frequency memory is no problem either, as this board supports 128 gigs of RAM at up to 5,000 MHz or more. For the rear I/O, we have access to USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C, 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-A, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type-A, and 2 Type-A 2.0 ports. The Realtek ALC1220 codec powers the auxiliary and S/PDIF outputs. A Realtek audio controller is also used for the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, and Intel's AX201 interface powers Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 5.1. All in all, this motherboard nearly has everything the average gamer could ask for. The VRMs are also enough to satisfy people who want to do high overclocks while keeping the price modest. Quite an impressive accomplishment on MSI's part. Number 2. MSI MEG Z490 Godlike. When talking about MSI's MEG lineup of motherboards, value isn't exactly a big concern. That could not be more evident than with the Z490 Godlike. With a naming convention like that, this motherboard certainly has a lot to live up to, especially if you consider the pricing that's quite high for even a Z490 board. For the right buyer, the Z490 Godlike does make a lot of sense though. This is an extended ATX motherboard, as that's the form factor best suited for overclocking and extra fancy features. You'll be greeted by massive shrouds and heat sinks after taking this one out of the box. The rear panel cover has an amazing mirror-like design that shows off the MSI Dragon. The chipset heatsink is massive and is combined with the bottom 2 M2 heatsinks. The gray, black, and metallic, almost blue, colors contrast with each other beautifully throughout this board. The VRM heatsinks might not be massive, but they are helped by 2 small fins hidden underneath the shrouds. The board has a 16 +1 phase power design. Needless to say, this is excellent for overclocking. You also get overclocking features to help you out in the BIOS and Windows software. Furthermore, you get 3 M2 slots, Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.1, and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. Perhaps the standout feature on this motherboard is the OLED display to the right of the DIMM slots. This is what MSI calls the Dynamic Dashboard 2. This screen can display the CPU speed, temperature, BIOS flash messages, and error messages. You also have the traditional 2-digit easy debug LEDs located just to the right of it. This helps with troubleshooting and looks awesome doing so. Overall, this is hands down the best Z490 motherboard for the enthusiast crowd. The customizable display is an excellent exclusive feature, and the beefy VRM configuration is always great to see. While the price is quite high, the Z490 motherboard is still less expensive than some of the more over-the-top Z590 choices. Number 1. ASUS ROG MAXIMUS 13 Apex. The 10900K is a top-tier processor. Our top pick needs to cater to that aspect perfectly. Many will agree that the best possible motherboard for this processor should be one that is great for extreme overclocking, has an abundance of features for gamers, and looks the part. ASUS is up to that task with the ROG MAXIMUS 13 Apex motherboard. The MAXIMUS 13 Apex was released quite a while ago after the MAXIMUS 13 Hero. While both motherboards are nearly identical, the Apex has even more overclocking features. Design-wise, there's a bit of a difference as well. While it features the same massive aluminum heatsink, along with the stealthy all-black PCB, it has a more aggressive design. The heatsinks are more angular. The VRM and M2 heatsinks are combined together, and all of the heatsinks have a more sleek finishing to them. You get 2 full-length PCIe Gen 4x16 slots for the GPU, 1x1 slot, and an impressive 4 M2 slots. 2 of these are Gen 4, while the other 2 use PCIe 3.0. You get Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.1, and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. You also get onboard buttons such as power, reset, BIOS, and you also get mode switches to save overclocking profiles. You also get ROG Supreme FX audio, which is great for gaming. The standout feature here is the massive 18-phase VRM design. This board features a gigantic heatsink for the VRMs, as this is an extended ATX motherboard. Remember that not all cases will support that huge form factor, so something to look out for. Needless to say, this thing overclocks both memory and CPU very well. Other than that, there's not much that needs to be said here. This is a high-end motherboard through and through. The VRM design, premium looks, and abundance of features speak for themselves. Of course, a high price is given at this point, but enthusiasts and overclockers won't mind that. Do you think another motherboard's better for the i9 10900K? Well, tell us your opinion.